So, starting off here, the essence of a good character is all in the shape. No amount of shading or textures or quality is going to change anything if you have terrible shape. So we're going to start off here by getting the basic shape of this dumbbell down. It's basically just two balls and one connector in the middle. And we will fast forward to when I have a better shape of this thing outlined. Oh, here's something that's pretty good. So if I'm ever trying to get something that has a really awkward width, say the middle part of this dumbbell, I'll usually make a line in the middle and scale it up to about the size I need it to. Then what I'll do is use the width tool on the middle area of this thing, pull it outward so it bulges in the middle, and then I'll convert it to a fill using a button in the properties section. And then I will use the ink bottle tool to put the outlines, resized of course, on the fill. Then all you gotta do is delete the fill, and I guarantee you the width and shape of the section you wanted will be perfect. The only problem I've found with using this method is that it creates a bunch of needless anchor points, so your outline is possibly going to be very rigid and has a bunch of very bumpy, usually around the edges. But you can use the pen deletion tool, to delete a lot of these anchor points that are just unnecessary. So what I'm doing next here is I'm going to shade each of these balls individually on the dumbbell. A good method for shading balls is you take the outline, you make it a different color or a different width or something so it's easy to delete later. You move it up a little bit, and then you place it down, and then you can shade right along. Also, to keep in mind, since this dumbbell is made up of 3 different shapes, you have to shade them all differently, or else it's going to just look weird. Okay, so now I will be coloring this object. What I usually like to do for colors is I take a base color from the reference that I have on the side, and you can just fill bucket tool it into your outline. And as for shading, I'll usually just take the base color and I'll scale it down a little bit, a couple hex codes, and that will usually result in a very good shade color. Although on this dumbbell in particular, I never really liked the colors a lot, and that's okay. Usually when you're first starting out to color an object or a character or some model, you're never going to like the colors that you pick first right off the bat. Don't expect that. Always want to change the colors a little bit more or a little bit less, or add some new colors or take out some colors that are terrible, you know? So I was never satisfied on this shade of the dumbbell, and eventually I will be, but it takes a while, you know? Also, if you can't tell, these are all pre-recorded, so this is future Lauren explaining what past Lauren was doing about like 5 weeks ago. Also, a little extra, I'm adding a shade where the handle would cascade on the bottom ball and where the top ball would cascade a shadow on the handle. It's not totally necessary, but it is good for depth. So now this dumbbell is near completion. We have it shaded, we have it colored, we have the outlines all good. There's a couple more things we have to do. I have to add that rusty gray texture that it looks like the dumbbell's worn, and I'm going to do a couple techniques for this. The first thing I do is I'm going to take the fills on the inside and I'm going to use the lasso tool and kind of move it around a bit to get like a rough, rigid texture, and I'll just place that over top on a different layer over top the dumbbell. So after I have those areas selected, I can cut away the unwanted parts. Now there's a couple ways I go about shading this in a second here. I start off trying to do something with gradients on this, and it's never usually good to mix the two shading techniques, flat shading and gradient shading. because they don't mix well. uh, I tried doing this first and then I give up and I just go for flat shading on it. And I believe what I do first is I take the outlines of the shade that I already have on the dumbbell and I put those over top, and then I just go where that shade where the outline is. And then I try a masking technique with a layer that is that has a transparent fill on top of it, and then you just basically mask that around the parts that you want shaded. So there's a ton of different shading techniques for doing stuff over other stuff. You just gotta find the technique that looks the best for the character. Okay, so now the character's done, completely done. Now all that's left to do is sizing it proportionally to other characters that I already have. So in my head, I wanted this character to be rather tall because it is rather tall in the game. So I decided to pick out the tallest character that I have and kind of scale it based on the asset that I made for that character, but not taller than that character because I wanted it to be the tallest. Scale is always really important whenever you're making these characters because you gotta know how they are proportionally to each other. So now we're gonna move on to the conifer spire, and right off the bat, I have zero ideas on how to tackle this character. Pine cones are really tough to get to look good. They're basically master level designs. So I rack my brain. I don't know what the heck I'm going to do for this character for a while. But eventually what I decided to do is make it rather symmetrical. So I'm going to do basically a pattern of each different fold or spike or whatever the things are called. A pattern until I reach the top. What's important when I'm doing this pattern to notice is that I am going to make a shape of how wide this pine cone is going to be and make a little egg shaped so I don't go out, or so I don't continue all the way up, and so I curve to the top. And B, you always have to size it down a little bit so that you kind of make a natural spike going at the top. So we'll fast forward through this part where it's just basically me doing busy work to get this thing to look symmetrical enough. And as for the top part, I decided to make a kind of basically a crazy spire based on what I see from the reference. And this worked out rather well. I don't have a lot of plans shading-wise for this pine cone. It's sort of just something that you don't shade. It's going to look good enough without shading. But I do decide to add a little design on the little spikes on the bottom, just to give it something extra, And I will do that for the entire spire. Once I get to the top, I try to shade the top, and it looks really bad to start off. because there's no like endpoints on those spikes themselves. They just kind of all look like one singular object. And you may notice that this thing looks really spiky, and there's no curved edges in this thing. I decided to go back on that. I didn't record it, but I basically curved the entire thing out and I fixed the top part. I don't know why I didn't record it. I was probably just like really done with the character because it took so long. But I will basically eventually figure out that looks better. So we're done with the conifer spire. As you can see, I rounded out all the little spikes and I fixed the top part. I didn't record that, unfortunately, but you can see that the design really shaped up and it looks really good now. Alright, now we're going to move on to the armored nut, and what I always do to start off any character is I add a couple layers above my reference, and I forgot to mention this on the last two, because if you don't do that, you're always going to be bumping into your reference, like constantly. So we're going to start off here by getting the shape, and I got to get the shape of the little, the meat of the acorn, basically, and the little hat that he's wearing. I'm going to end up just tracing it because it's an awkward shape, and you know awkward shapes are pretty hard to work with when you just don't trace them. Alright, so now we're going to move on to shading this thing. A few things to keep in mind. You have to shade the hat and the nut a little bit differently since they're on like diff planes basically, so make the hat's shading kind of pop out farther than the nut's shading on the bottom. I'm going to do something a little bit differently when I shine this nut. I'm going to take the outline of the nut and basically cut away some of the parts I don't want, and I'm going to scale that line up and color it a different line and kind of offset it from in the middle of from the outline, and that'll give you a nice little looking shine. So now I gotta get the little like plaid design for the top of the nut, and what I decide to do is I decide to use a transparent line design for the top so that A, it's gonna be darker where the outline is, and B, I don't have to shade the design individually or make a mask for the shading. I just have to make a mask for the design. Another thing to note while resizing, usually I made this nut a little bit bigger than I wanted it to, and lines, they keep their thickness throughout. So you're going to have to do a lot of editing to get the line thickness to look good and have your character still look good. Alright, Armored Nut is done. Let's move on to the anti-hiccup fungus. So this character, I decided to do full gradient shading and basically a gradient color scheme for the character. I like doing that for a lot of organic or plant stuff, and we'll see how I achieve some of that in a second here. So the gradient tool is key for making any character that has a gradient color scheme, basically. You're going to use it for your outlines, you're going to use it for your fills, you're going to use it when you shade, you're going to use it for any design that you want on the top that has also a gradient as well. So I'm basically just going to get the color schemes of these gradients all laying out for you in a second, so we'll fast forward through me doing that. So when it comes to shading a gradient character, Flash doesn't allow you to have very complex gradients like a bitmap program does, like Paint SAI or Photoshop. So you got to improvise a little bit. What I usually typically end up doing is I will map out the shade with outlines. I will make it transparent. I'll turn it into a symbol, and I'm going to blur that symbol using the blur effect, which can be found under properties and then filters. Coming up here in a second, I'm also going to add a little ribbed design on the head of the mushroom, and I end up doing that by creating 3 lines and making them different thicknesses, and then I will make them transparent and do that same technique where you make it a symbol and then you blur the symbol, and it'll end up looking really natural and really good for gradients. I'm also going to be doing gradient outlines for this instead of just a singular colored outline, and that's going to really bring home the gradient effect I have on this mushroom. Alright, so anti-hiccup fungus is done. Let's move on to the Seed of Greed. This character is pretty easy. The most important aspect of this character, of course, is shape again. I start off by making a triangle and then rounding off that triangle, but I find what works better for this type of character, because I want that bulge, is just making a circle and basically cutting off the top of the circle with another circle and kind of fixing the two of them together. So you'll see me do that here in a sec. Alright, so the shape is done for this guy. There's not too much more to do. It's basically just coloring and shading and shining. The only other advice I can give is make sure to maintain that depth between where the character kind of lips off at the top there. So with the finalizing of the Seed of Greed, that will conclude this episode. I hope whoever stuck around to the end found it very useful. I hope to see people use the tactics I described in this video to make better character designs. Thank you for sticking around with me. I don't know what else I have planned for this series. I'll probably end up streaming a couple times me making these characters so you can see in real time, and I'll answer questions and stuff, and maybe I'll have some guests on as well. Stay tuned for more content in the future. This is Lauren, signing off.